This video should give you a basic introduction on the files you would expect to see in any given DataJoint element repository versus the corresponding workflow. For a full list of each of the elements and their workflows, please visit elements.datajoint.org. What I have here for our discussion today is two GitHub repositories. So this is the GitHub's lightweight IDE, and this is for element array EFIS, as well as the corresponding workflow array EFIS. So in the element itself, there's relatively few things that the average user would need to open up and use for themselves, but instead, it's just one way to become familiar with the tables in the element. So here in this element array EFIS subfolder, you have each of the schemas associated with the element. The diagram in the README gives you a sense of the tables and their relative connection to one another, but still diving into the schema itself can be helpful. There are definitions for each of the tables, table name, table type, as we discussed in our quick intro. Other things to be aware of include this activation function, which we'll see a little bit later in the context of the workflow pipeline. But also in this activation function is the docstring that lets you know what this element schema needs in order to work in the context of a broader workflow. So here we need upstream tables for both session and skull reference, as well as functions to get EFIS root directory, as well as get session directory. This linking module piece is part of our activation function because it allows this schema to be aware of all of the objects in the namespace of the module that activated it. Turning over to the workflow, the first thing I'll point out is that the README shows you each of the elements involved in this workflow. Theoretically, you could construct a workflow with all of the elements, but for the purposes of a tutorial, it makes the most sense to really focus in on one element per workflow. These notebooks provide you Jupyter Hub notebooks to look through the elements for help activating the tables, populating them, and a little bit of the information you would need to make the best choice for one schema within an element versus another. The files that surround that are what make those notebooks possible. So the first thing I'll point out in each of our workflow is the config file. This is, if you name it as DJ local config, when you activate a schema from this workflow directory, this is what will give DataJoint your credentials and a sense of what database host to use. Certain elements also rely on pieces within the custom field. So we saw that EFIS root data directory function earlier in the context of the element. This is where that function is pulling those root data directories from. And in order to specifically define that process, we can look at the paths script here in the workflow subfolder. So this path defines the get EFIS root data directory by looking at the DataJoint config and the custom and EFIS root data dir field. You could always define it differently. We recommend that in using these elements, you separate out the root path from the relative path of your data files on top of that, because that allows for better collaboration across colleagues. I can have my data directory mountain in one location, my colleague another, and yet we can still work with the same relative paths in the context of the DataJoint pipeline. Each of our elements rely on this function called find full path. So even if you have multiple possible root paths, we're always going to look for the one that makes the most sense given the relative path specified in the table, the relevant table. Really, the heart of this workflow is here in the pipeline. So this is where we pull in each of the elements together, animal, lab, session, and the tables from them to populate our pipeline namespace. And then, as I mentioned before, these activated functions really belong here in this pipeline so that you're activating the schemas in order and all at the same time. Using this, you could write out a function along the lines of from workflow and then whatever your workflow is. From your command line, from workflow pipeline, import this schema to get you started with the activation process and get the relevant tables in your namespace all at once. Moving on from pipeline, each of the workflows has a set of ingestion functions that help you ingest from a user data subdirectory, some CSV files there into manual tables to save the little bit tedious process of ingesting subjects one by one. The automate notebook will take you through using those functions for any given workflow. Finally, some of our workflows offer a processing script or process script. This is just the set of populate commands, make functions that would be required for any given schema. So we can populate the EFIS recording table, populate the local fields potential table all at once just by running this process script. The last things I'll point out are more for developers than average users. So these two subfolders here, tests and Docker, are for creating Docker environments in which we would then run integration tests. So those are just the tests that help us as developers know that the elements are working as they should as we push updates. Saves us time of testing each individual piece. But what these Docker files also give, for someone familiar with Docker, is an ability to generate an environment that already has all of the workflow pieces in the namespace. Turning back to my notes here, this has given you an overview of the items you should expect to see in each of the elements and the workflows. For more information on the elements themselves, please visit our elements website, and then we'll also be releasing videos soon enough about each of the elements themselves. Feel free to leave your questions in the comments, and please visit the description for more links on each of these topics. Thanks.